Women have always faced difficulties throughout history. In the early 1800s, women had few rights. Women were not encouraged to obtain a real education or pursue a professional career. After marriage, women did not have the right to own their own property, keep their own wages, or sign a contract. All women were also denied the right to vote. Although women had many moral obligations and duties in their homes, church, and community, they had few political and legal rights in the new republic. One famous occasion was when Abigail Adams reminded her husband John during the Constitutional Convention to, quote, remember the ladies. Her warning was ignored. Women were pushed to the sidelines as dependents of men. The women's suffrage movement began in 1848 and was a struggle to allow women the right to vote and run for office. For much of the 1850s, they fought against the denial of basic economic freedoms to women. The reform effort evolved throughout the 19th century and it initially emphasized a broad spectrum of goals before focusing solely on securing the rights for women. And this is a photograph of the women's suffrage parade in Washington, D.C. Ultimately, the suffrage movement provided political training for some of the early women pioneers in Congress, but its internal divisions foreshadowed the persistent disagreements among women in Congress and among women's rights activists after the passing of the 19th Amendment by the Senate. And this is a photograph of suffragists demonstrating against Woodrow Wilson in Chicago, 1916. These are photographs of women from other states that were also pioneers and participants in the women's suffrage movement. In 1849, Elizabeth Blackwell became the first woman to receive a medical degree from an American medical school. Her months there were extremely difficult. Townspeople and much of the male student body would make fun of her and some even harassed her. She persevered, however, and in January 1849 ranked first in her class. She went on to study obstetrics and pediatrics in Europe before returning to the United States to start her own practice in New York City. The strides she made in her career opened doors for generations of women in medicine. Although there were new women in medicine, there still weren't any women of color who had received a medical degree. Rebecca Lee Crumpler helped break barriers to a large extent, as evidenced by being the first African American woman in the United States to earn a Doctor of Medicine degree, fighting racism, and by forging the path forward for women of color in medicine. Rebecca Lee Crumpler was the first African American woman in the United States to earn a medical degree. Rebecca attended a prestigious private school, the West Newton English and Classical School in Massachusetts. In 1860, she took the bold step of applying to medical school and was accepted into the New England Female Medical College. While in the medical college, many male physicians derided the institution, complaining that women lacked the physical strength to practice medicine. After the end of the Civil War in 1865, the Crumplers moved to Richmond, Virginia, where she found, quote, the proper field for real missionary work, and one that would present ample opportunities to become acquainted with the diseases of women and children. Others insisted that not only were women incapable of mastering a medical curriculum, and that many of the topics taught were inappropriate for their, quote, sensitive and delicate nature. She wrote a book titled A Book of Medical Discourses in 2 parts, which was published by Cashman, Keating & Co. of Boston in 1883. Rebecca Lee Crumpler also helped fight against racism and sexism. She challenged the prejudice that prevented African Americans from pursuing careers in medicine. She joined other black physicians in caring for freed slaves who would have otherwise had no access to medical care. She also worked in missionary and community groups, even though black physicians experienced intense racism. Crumpler also stressed the importance of quality care regardless of race or economic status, writing that it is just as important that a doctor should be in attendance before the birth of a poor woman's child as that he should be present before the birth of the child of wealth. Some of the challenges to women entering medicine were discrimination, sexual harassment, and having a male-dominated environment. Crumpler also helped pave the way for women in medicine. By the end of the 19th century, there were more than 7,000 women physicians in the United States, comprising roughly 5.5% of the total number of doctors in the country. It would take almost 160 years from the time Crumpler enrolled in medical school before equal numbers of women and men entered medicine. This is a photograph of the Medical Women's International Association. Today, women represent 35% of all doctors, but Black women still only represent about 2%. Not until 2017 did more women than men in the United States enroll in medical school, representing 50.7% of matriculants.